prosecution submission.
This is Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The USS Missouri has been converted into a museum. The World War II battleship is anchored in Pearl Harbor and is now a popular tourist destination. On September 2nd, 1945, the Japanese Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu and the Chief of the Imperial Japanese Army General Staff, Yoshijiro Uematsu, signed Japan's unconditional surrender on the deck of this very ship. They surrendered on behalf of the Emperor of Japan and the Japanese Imperial General Headquarters. It marked the formal end of World War II. 10 days later, the Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, General Douglas MacArthur, ordered the arrest of 39 Japanese war criminal suspects. Former Prime Minister Hideki Tojo was the first name on the list. Elliot Falk, head of US counterintelligence, after receiving the order, soon dispatched soldiers to serve the arrest warrant. Reporters quickly camped out at Tojo's residence. Tojo looked out his window and, realizing what was transpiring, reached for his pistol. The American military police ran into the room and saw blood gushing from Tojo's chest. The bullet had missed his heart because he was left-handed. He was rushed to the US Army's 98th Evacuation Hospital in Yokohama.
At an American evacuation hospital in Japan, U.S. doctors attempt to save ill-famed Tojo with a transfusion of American blood. The volunteer is Sergeant John Arkinall, who, like all of us, wants Tojo to live and stand trial.
Saving Tojo's life had only one purpose: to make him stand trial. However, the trial needed to be conducted in a fair and transparent manner. Potsdam is a small town west of Berlin in Germany. The Potsdam Declaration was signed here in Sicilienhof Palace towards the end of World War II. On July 26, 1945, the leaders of the United States, United Kingdom, and Soviet Union issued the Potsdam Declaration. The document urged Japan to surrender immediately and unconditionally. It also authorized legal punishment of war criminals. The Japanese government held 2 emergency cabinet meetings in response to the declaration. They decided to center their legal defense on exonerating the emperor. They would defend their country as well as themselves. On August 28, 1945, the first American soldiers landed in Japan. There was a 2-week period between the Allied forces' arrival at Atsugi Airport and their full occupation of the country. At that point, the Japanese government and the Imperial Army were well aware they would be held accountable for war crimes. Cabinet members decided to burn all the evidence and documents in their possession. The order was clear and simple: do not leave a single scrap of paper. From that time on, there would be no trace of meeting memos or written records from the Supreme Council for the Direction of the War. Documents in the Philippines and Southeast Asia were also destroyed, as were the files concerning China and Manchuria.
でそれを恐れてもう徹底的に証拠隠滅を図る。これはもう上から下で軍部だけでなく外務省、それから内務省かな、官庁も日本軍の公式な文書、あとそれを見た今度一般の兵士とか将校も個人の日記を燃やすわけですよね。
In the meantime, MacArthur had issued 4 arrest warrants for the 118 most wanted Japanese war criminals. The warrants were for senior commanders of the army or government officials responsible for initiating the war. In order to obtain enough evidence against the accused, MacArthur established the International Prosecution Section, or IPS, in December 1945. Joseph Keenan was appointed its director. Among the first things the IPS did was issue a charter, which officially announced the establishment of the International Military Tribunal for the Far East. Article 2 of the Charter states the tribunal shall consist of not less than 5, nor more than 9 members.
Given a large number of participants in the war effort, the US President Harry Truman wanted to let the Philippines and India participate. At the time of the planning stage, neither country was independent. There was a strong desire on the part of the British government that India, having had a part in the war effort, so that started a conversation of getting American colony to participate as well. So these two countries were added later on.
The International Military Tribunal for the Far East had 11 judges, one each from Australia, the United States, China, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, Canada, France, the Netherlands, New Zealand, India, and the Philippines. Justice William Webb of Australia was named the tribunal's president. Justice Mei Ju-ao and prosecutor Xiang Che-chun were appointed the representatives of China. Meanwhile, the International Prosecution Section, headed by Keenan, was collecting evidence. After the Japanese destroyed a vast amount of evidence, it was difficult to determine who was accountable for Japan's actions. To speed up the collection of evidence, Keenan set up an investigation branch staffed by former FBI operatives.
The International Prosecution Section was established with the mission to collect evidence concerning crimes against peace, which is the offense of planning, preparing, initiating, and waging aggressive war, or participate in a common plan to do so.
IPS prosecutors eventually uncovered 3 essential documents: the diary of Koichi Kido, the Lord Keeper of the Privy Seal, and Emperor Hirohito's closest advisor; the interrogation records of Ryokichi Tanaka, Major General of the Imperial Japanese Army, and Koichi's memorandum of the Privy Council. These 3 documents greatly helped to determine who was responsible for what among Japan's senior officers and government officials.
隠してる、あるいは疎開してるっていうような書類もあるんですよね。で、例えば木戸光一の、内大臣木戸光一の日記ですね。これなんかも、この裁判がなければ、あの時点では出てこなかったでしょうし、かなりの、貴重な資料がですね、この裁判でもって集まった。これは東京裁判の甚だ大きな遺産かと思うんですね。
The Chinese government also considered the list of war criminals a matter of great importance. In October 1945, China established a committee to determine its strategy on war criminals. Xu Yongchang, who was the Chinese representative aboard the US Missouri when Japan surrendered, wrote in his diary, "On October 16, 1945, during a meeting concerning Japanese war criminals, Mr. Chiang handpicked the first 12 who were most responsible." According to Chiang Kai-shek's manuscript, the list originally contained 20 names. 12 of those he placed in order of importance, including Class A war criminals Kenji Doahara, Seishiro Itagaki, and Hideki Tojo, and then crossed out 2 names with a red pen. Between February and March 1946, the Chinese government, through prosecutor Xiang Che-chun, submitted 2 lists with 33 war criminal suspects to General MacArthur. Having considered opinions from many countries, the International Prosecution Section decided on a list of 28 Class A war criminals. It was passed immediately after MacArthur received it. The list included the names of 4 prime ministers, 3 foreign ministers, 10 from the Japanese Army, 3 from the Japanese Navy, 2 ambassadors, and the Lord Keeper of the Privy Seal of Japan.
The selection of war criminals in cases of large-scale conflicts with mass atrocity is always a very difficult process. Because of the duration and the scale of the conflict, the Tokyo defendants were selected both for their individual roles, but also as representatives of all of the different parts of the Japanese government and military that had contributed to both starting the war from 1931 to 1945, and also had participated in the commission of war crimes.
The International Military Tribunal for the Far East was held at Ichigaya Court, formerly the Imperial Japanese Army headquarters in Tokyo. This building housed the Imperial Japanese Army Academy, the country's most well-known military academy. During wartime, all military orders were issued from the headquarters. Looking back, it's a miracle this building survived the American airstrike towards the end of the war. On May 3, 1946, the International Military Tribunal for the Far East was officially convened. Nobody had expected the trial would take 2 years and 6 months.
International Military Tribunal for the Far East. Number 1.
While the indictment was being read, something unexpected occurred. Japanese nationalist writer Shumei Okawa, who was sitting on the defendant's bench, began crying out loud. For a long time, he had been advocating Pan-Asianism. His courtroom behavior was captured on camera.
那个东条呢就坐在第2排，八堂小妹坐第3排，就在他前面。东条光头，啪一下子嘛，后面美国的 MP 啊就宪兵啊来抓起来，抓起来嘛他就装疯。
Okawa was examined by an American psychiatrist and was diagnosed with a mental illness. As a result, the charges against him were dropped.
我什么发疯？我装疯，他装的，那过去法庭被他骗过去。
The International Military Tribunal for the Far East was conducted in the manner of common law. The key feature in this system is the exchange between the prosecution and the defense. During this trial, both sides brought witnesses, heard testimonies, and submitted evidence. There were 3 major incidents covered by the tribunal: the Nanjing Massacre, the attack on Pearl Harbor, and the Bataan Death March. Japan had invaded China first and occupied parts of the country the longest. For these reasons, the largest amount of evidence the prosecution team submitted concerned the Nanjing Massacre. It soon became clear it was one of the most horrific atrocities committed during World War II. On August 13, 1937, Japan launched the Battle of Shanghai. It lasted about 3 months. Soon after the fall of Shanghai, the invading army was divided into 3 separate forces that attacked Nanjing, China's capital at the time. On December 13th, Nanjing fell to the Japanese. That moment and the next 6 weeks became known as the Nanjing Massacre. Many soldiers participated in the massacre, and the commanding officer of these forces was Iwani Matsue, general of the Japanese Central China Area Army. Tokushi Kasahara, a professor emeritus at Tsuru University, is one of the foremost scholars of the Nanjing Massacre in Japan. He has authored many books on the subject.
それは松井岩の場合は蒋介石政府を屈服させるっていうそういう発想を持ってますから、できるだけ日本軍の強いところを見せるっていうのと、あと日本の戦争の場合はこれやっぱり南京戦の場合から日本の昔からの戦争があるんですけど、ある城下町を襲った場合は全部皆殺しなんですよね。女性子供を含めて全部殺すっていうのが日本の戦争であったわけですね。
In early March 1945, Chief Prosecutor Keenan, accompanied by Chinese prosecutor Xiang, led a team of investigators from Tokyo to China. David Nelson Sutton was amongst them. In order to collect evidence, he brought a Chinese map. They stayed in Nanjing, Shanghai, and Peking for more than 2 weeks and brought back many witnesses and much evidence.
南京型について国際検事局はもう資料たくさんあるっていう、だからもうこれはもう絶対否定できないっていう、そういう意味では一番自信を持ったのが南京大虐殺事件で、だから唯一日本軍の残虐行為、人道に反する、事件の中で南京大虐殺が東京裁判で取り上げられたんですけど。
In July 1946, the International Military Tribunal for the Far East started to present evidence regarding the Nanjing massacre.
And nothing but the truth, so help you God. Be seated. John Gillespie McGee. I was a missionary of the Episcopal Church at Nanking from 1912 to 1940.
Were you in Nanking throughout the month of December 1937, January and February 1938?
I was.
During the massacre, Reverend John McGee risked his life to film abuses of Chinese civilians by Japanese soldiers using a 16mm camera. This was the strongest surviving video evidence of the Nanjing massacre.
What was the action of the Japanese soldiers toward the civilian Chinese men after they had possession of the city of Nanking on December 13, 1937?
It was unbelievably terrible. The killing began immediately in several ways, often by individual Japanese soldiers or up to 30 soldiers together going about, each one seeming to have the power of life or death. And then soon there was organized killing of great bodies of men, and I passed columns of men being taken out to be killed. These people were being killed by rifle fire and machine gun principally. Also we knew of groups of several hundred being bayoneted to death. One woman told me that her husband's hands were tied in front of her, and he was thrown into a pond, and they stayed there and wouldn't let her rescue him. He was drowned before her face.
US-based Life magazine had reported on the atrocities committed by the Japanese army in Nanjing as early as May 16, 1938. A secret telegram intercepted in Germany also reported on the horrors taking place in Nanjing. It read, "It is not this Japanese nor that Japanese. It is the entire Imperial Japanese Army. They have made Nanjing a living hell." There was a man in Reverend McGee's film who had repeatedly saved the sick and wounded. His name was Robert Wilson, an American doctor. Although his film could not be found, a typewritten testimony exists which contains a number of events in which Japanese soldiers abused Chinese civilians. A girl of 19, about 4.5 months pregnant with her first child, was brought from the grounds of the American school. She had stab wounds in the lower abdomen, which I ascertained she received when she resisted rape at the hands of a Japanese soldier. The wounds caused an abortion.
南京大虐殺当時は日本の新聞は一切そういうことを報道しない。で、勝ったっていう。で、あたかも、南京の市民が日本軍を歓迎したっていう、そういう報道ばっかりするわけです。それからあとは厳密に、日本の場合は軍隊が兵隊の手紙を検閲するわけですね。
Tokushi Kasahara was born in 1944. His father named him Tokushi because it was the 19th year of the Showa period. In the same year, his father was drafted into the Japanese army. He was trained as a human bomb to use sticks of dynamite to blow up Allied tanks.
私の父は大変運が良くて、若い時にもう両親が亡くなって、 で結構苦労して自分で勉強して小学校の教師になった。だからもともと自分とすれば非常に家庭的に不幸な家庭だったもんですから、ようやく結婚してで僕たちが生まれてで幸せな家庭ができたのに戦争が始まってっていう。
The war ended before Kasahara's father saw any action in battle, but the fear of war was deeply rooted in Kasahara's family. In 1964, Kasahara, then a freshman researching Japanese history in Tokyo University of Education, happened to read a book. In it, one chapter described the Nanjing Massacre. This ignited a deep interest in what happened all those years ago. To this day, many Japanese don't know about the massacre. Kasahara has many books about the Nanjing Massacre in his study, along with the data he has compiled. However, because of very limited papers and data open to the public by the Japanese government back then, he went to the United States many times in the 1980s to acquire first-hand materials.
でこれが南京マッサカーストーリーっていうで日本軍がサウザン何万人って殺したっていうでこれが1937年の12月15日だから本当早い、一番多分世界で南京大学について最初に報道したっていうこういう人物ですね。
Chicago Daily News journalist A.T. Steele, together with F.T. Durden of the New York Times, were the earliest to report the Nanjing Massacre to the West. Kasahara met them and gained a deeper understanding of that period in history.
で私はこの2人の記者にインタビューしてで彼ら直接見てるわけでしょ。だから本当確信を持ちましたね。だから実際虐殺の時にいた人が自分で目で見てでそれを私に語ってくれたんでもう間違いなく。
At the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, Japanese Foreign Minister Hirota Koki, Vice Staff Officer of the Japanese Central China Area Army Muto Akira, and Chief Commander of the Japanese Central China Area Army Matsui Iwani were the only 3 defendants charged with war crimes related to the Nanjing Massacre. Matsui's defense was based on him recuperating in a place 200 kilometers from Nanjing. Thus, he claimed he knew nothing about the massacre. In his affidavit, Matsui emphasized the war between Japan and China was out of brotherly relations rather than a real invasion.
I was always firm in the belief that the strife between Japan and China was a quarrel between brothers in the so-called household evasions.
The action was to make China come to her senses, not out of hatred, but out of love.
I instructed my officers and men to give protection and to be decent to the Chinese people and to have a regard for the foreign rights and interests in China.
For Japan, it was the first time it had conquered the capital of an enemy state. The whole nation felt a surge of pride, and a large-scale ceremony was held when entering Nanjing. Exactly at that time, the atrocities began.
もともと作戦なかった、準備もなくて南京占領をするわけですね。で周りで、食料を略奪してで抵抗すれば殺すっていうことそれから、男子の場合は女性を見つけばレイプする強姦するっていうそういうもう犯罪集団になりながら南京に行った。東京裁判の場合は彼が最高司令官ですからいくら不作為ともいえやっぱ司令官の責任があったわけです。
In Nanjing today, people visit the memorial hall of the victims in the Nanjing massacre by Japanese invaders. Although the pain and suffering inflicted during the massacre was immense, it was typical of what Japanese soldiers were doing elsewhere in China and Southeast Asia during the war.
The Nanjing massacre was probably the largest single massacre, but it was representative of what was happening everywhere in China. People were being killed, were being raped, were being tortured, and so forth by Japanese soldiers everywhere the Japanese army occupied territory, whether it was during the China campaign or whether it was in Southeast Asia, and so forth.
During the tribunal, Matsui was charged only for the Nanjing massacre. He was found guilty of dereliction of duty and sentenced to death by hanging. Before his death, he said to the executioner, "Even if I were the only one to be executed today, I would be gratified if the then soldiers, be there only one of them, could reflect on themselves deeply." Until his very last breath, Matsui believed he was not responsible for the Nanjing massacre and that it was his subordinates who were to blame. On this Tokyo street are the offices of the former Prime Minister of Japan, Kan Naoto.
日中関係は長い歴史の中で、特に1900年代の全般ですね、やはり非常に不幸な時代があったと思っています。それは主に日本がやはり中国を侵略したことが一つの大きな原因だったと思っています。ですからそのことはですね、やはり日本にとってはきちんとですね、反省すべきことだと思ってまして。
This memorial straddles the wreck of the sunken Arizona warship. The names of the 1,177 officers and crew who were killed on board the ship are engraved on this wall. On December 7th, 1941, the Japanese launched a sneak attack on Pearl Harbor. The attack lasted only 90 minutes, but in that time, Japan damaged 8 battleships, sinking 4 of them. The attack destroyed 188 aircraft, killed 2,403 Americans. Japan only lost 29 planes in the battle. 1 hour after the attack, Japan declared war against the United States and Britain. It marked America's entry into World War II and the beginning of the Pacific theater of the war.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked.
Back then, the conflict between Japan and America had been brewing for some time. On September 27th, 1940, Germany, Italy, and Japan signed an alliance treaty in Berlin to speed up their invasive wars. It was the formal formation of the Axis powers. Confronted with Japan's expansion across Asia, America soon became more vigilant. In July 1940, America enacted the Export Control Act, which banned the export of iron and steel to Japan. 1 year later, the ban was extended to copper, rubber, and oil exports. Japan was heavily dependent on imported resources, thus the embargo was almost a declaration of war. But Japan wasn't ready for a direct confrontation with America just yet. The Japanese government then distracted America by beginning negotiations over the embargo. However, this was a ruse, as during that time, Marshal Admiral and Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, Yamamoto Isoroku, had already begun planning the attack on Pearl Harbor.
There was an element of truth in saying that, insofar as Japan was inherently a resource-scarce nation. In order for Japan to survive and flourish, it had to have access to resources that are not available in Japan but abroad. And in order to do that, Japan had to resort to diplomacy and war.
On October 17th, 1941, Hideki Tojo took office and formed his cabinet, giving himself the position General of the Army. From then on, war with the West was inevitable.
国民が一体を挙げて国に報い、国に準ずるの時は今であります。この緊急報告の大精神ある限り、英米といえども何ら恐るるに足らないのであります。
On December 26, 1947, the International Military Tribunal for the Far East began interrogating Tojo. For many Americans, sentencing Tojo was the primary goal of the tribunal because he was responsible for the bombardment of Pearl Harbor. On that day, reporters from around the world were on hand to record the historical moment. Tojo's wife and daughter were also there. Outside, scalpers were selling seats to the courtroom.
因为跑进去好冷的，比如明天开庭，今天下午就在门口，法庭门口一个地方专门发门票的地方排队的。所以东德运去的时候呢，好多人去排队。那么他门票有一定限制的，那么门票发完就没有了。那么所以有些人要看嘛，就出高价去做生意了，等于。
Before the trial, Tojo spent his time in Sugamo prison writing an affidavit which amounted to 220 pages and is said to have been revised 4 times. 3 days were spent in court reading out Tojo's affidavit. There were no witnesses who testified on his behalf and no other evidence presented to the court. Tojo defended his actions and told the court the Pacific War was Japan's last resort and for the sake of self-defense. On December 31st, 1947, Chief Prosecutor Keenan began the cross-examination of Tojo.
Tojo, I shall not address you as general, because of course you know that there is no longer any Japanese army.
During the trial, Keenan revealed Japan's scheme of hiding its war preparations through negotiations.
The liaison conference had made its final proposal and instructed the Japanese ambassador that that was the final proposal and there could be no change made in it. Well, we better make sure and let you look at it in black and white. It sometimes helps your memory.
示しましたろう。ただし、しかしながら外交というものは、昨日も申しましたように相手があります。外交軍事政治というのは相手のある仕事です。相手の出方によって、またやり方というのは変化してくるんです。そこのゆとりはどこの国でも持っているはずです。
Justice Webb also questioned Tojo regarding the timing of the Pearl Harbor attack. However, the answer was self-contradictory.
Why was this date, 25th November, chosen?
それは外務大臣の考えた処置でありまして、総理大臣としてはその当時的確にそういうことは知りません。
Was the fixation of this date connected with the order previously issued to the fleet to sail on the 26th November?
ありません。また外務大臣がそういうことを知ってるはずがないです。
Well, we needn't comment on that reply. That was always a possibility.
The court unanimously believed the Japanese army caused hundreds of thousands of innocent deaths in the Asian battlefield and tortured thousands of Allied prisoners of war. The court ruled Tojo should assume primary responsibility. He was found guilty of 54 of the 55 charges and was hanged as the top war criminal. Nine hours after Japan's sneak attack at Pearl Harbor, Japan attacked and heavily damaged America's Clark Air Base in the Philippines. MacArthur retreated but proclaimed, "I shall return." In order to contain the Japanese army and win more time for America and Australia to mobilize for war, a group of American soldiers in Bataan fought for 4 months, despite no supplies and a lack of weapons. They eventually surrendered, which was unprecedented in American history. However, nobody expected the Japanese army would treat the prisoners of war so cruelly. Due to a lack of food and water, about 80,000 American and Philippine soldiers were forced to walk 120 kilometers to reach a prison camp. About 15,000 prisoners died on the way. American veteran Lester Tenney survived the Bataan Death March. In his book, My Hitch in Hell, he recalls, "We all suffered psychological damage after our surrender, and then helplessly watched our buddies being killed right in front of us, powerless to stop the slaughter, and always fearful that we would be next." This is the Bataan Death March, which together with the Nanjing Massacre and the Death Railway are referred to as the 3 atrocities in the Far East. Atsumi Aiko is a professor at the university who has dedicated herself to the study of B and C class war criminals, as well as the maltreatment of POWs. In her office are displayed the historical materials she has collected throughout the years. Through her research, Utsumi says torturing prisoners of war runs deep in the Japanese army and was related to military propaganda.
1941年、東條英機があまりにも乱れた兵士の軍紀、それを正すために先人訓というのを出します。その中に捕虜に関する項目があります。生きて領袖の恥ずかしめを受けず、そういう教えを兵士たちに教えます。ですから捕虜監視員になった人に聞くと、自分たちはね、死んでもね、捕虜になってはいけないと教わったのに、目の前にいる捕虜の人たちはみんな堂々としてるんですね。将校が威張ってるとやっぱりカッときたり、そういう人もいるし、とにかく働かせないといけないから将校も働かせようとする。それでこういうふうにトラブルが起こる。
At the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, a data map was displayed. On it was marked the number of people who were tortured to death in the Philippines, about 23,000 American soldiers and 91,000 Filipino civilians.
In Germany and Italy, 142,319 British prisoners of war were reported captured, and of those, 7,310, or 5.1%, were killed or died in captivity. 50,016 British prisoners of war were in the power of the Japanese, and of these, 12,433, or 24.8%, were killed or died in captivity. Prisoners of war had no rights whatever.
Samuel B. Moody, a survivor of the Bataan Death March, was the first to appear in court as a witness.
We were treated throughout the march by the Japanese very badly. We were beaten, the men were bayoneted, stabbed, they were kicked with the hobnail boots.
In the case of the Bataan Death March, though, the prisoners of war were made to march for many days from the place of surrender to the place of internment. The Japanese, they were not prepared to provide for these individuals. When seeing these POWs not following the orders to march, they would be beaten, summarily executed. These individuals were never properly fed because the Japanese weren't prepared to do that.
Yes. I realized I was still alive, but pretended to be dead and fell over on my right side.
Colin Fleming Bryan, a 23-year-old Australian POW, was captured in Singapore. He was lashed in the neck by a Japanese soldier and narrowly escaped death. He showed his wound in court during the tribunal. Sister Vivian Bullwinkle, who served as a nurse in the Australian Army, testified about what the Japanese did on Banks Islands.
They then ordered 23 of us march into the sea. We had gone a few yards into the water when they commenced to machine gun from behind. I saw the girls falling one after the other when I was hit.
日本は1929年のジュネーブ条約、署名はしたんだけど批准してないんです。陸軍海軍などが反対したんです。うちに向かってはジュネーブ条約を日本が批准してるなんてこと全然説明していません。外に向かっては巡洋を説明するから、向こうはジュネーブ条約を日本は守るんだな。だからそこで今日本がよくダブルスタンダードなんです。対面鉄道を作った小隊長はジュネーブ条約知ってます。その人は大学の法学部出てますから。だけどジュネーブ条約を守ってできるような現場ではなかった。だからこの人はその板挟みになるけども命令に従って鉄道を作っていく。
Delfin Yarania was the judge representing the Philippines at the tribunal. He was also a survivor of the Bataan Death March. Yarania did not appear in court while evidence about the march was presented to the tribunal. Those charged with torturing prisoners of war were tried as B or C-class war criminals in other Allied tribunals. Not long after Japan's surrender, the Allies organized a Manila military court to try Japanese prisoners who committed atrocities in the Philippines during the war. Homa Masaharu, the lieutenant general who led Japan's 14th Division in its invasion of the Philippines, and Yamashita Tomoyuki, a senior general who held the post of the highest commander of the Japanese army late in the war, were brought to trial at the Manila military court for torturing prisoners of war. They were found guilty and sentenced to death.
In regard to the conventional war crime of the kind that the Japanese committed everywhere else the Imperial Army had occupied territory, massacres of civilians, rape of women, employment of torture, so on and so forth, I think that they knew what they had done and did not believe that they were innocent of those charges.
戦争裁判の記録、検察が出した証拠書類をずっと調べていったら、6分の1は捕虜に関する書類でした。捕虜虐待をした人はこれを厳しく裁く。こういう姿勢で裁判に臨んでいく。
On April 16, 1948, the International Military Tribunal for the Far East is in session for the writing of the judgment. On November the 12th, 1948, after 817 court sessions, the tribunal reconvened to announce the verdicts. 25 defendants were summoned one by one.
In accordance with Article 15H of the Charter, the International Military Tribunal for the Far East will now pronounce the sentences on the accused convicted on this indictment.
Araki Sadao, Doyahara Kenji, Itagaki Shiro, Hirota Koki, Kimura Hayataro, Muto Akira, and Hideki Tojo were sentenced to death by hanging. 16 others were sentenced to life imprisonment. One was sentenced to 20 years in prison and another to 7. The Tokyo trials lasted 2.5 years. During that time, suspected Class B and C war criminals were tried elsewhere. Military tribunals in Nanjing, Shanghai, Manila and Australia tried a combined 5,634 suspected war criminals, and 987 of them were sentenced to death. On December 23, 1948, 7 Class A war criminals were hanged. The executions took 33 minutes. The Tokyo trials, along with the Nuremberg trials, were unprecedented in human history. It was the first time suspected war criminals were charged by an international court and tried by law. Both trials established precedents which the UN has since upheld. It is deemed as a crime against international law to disturb peace, wage war, and override humanity, and those who violate the rule should be punished and pay a high price.
その膨大な犠牲者のためにですね、戦争犯罪を犯した人間は必ず責任を問われるということですね。
したがって我々は当然東京裁判の結果を尊重しなきゃいけませんし、東京裁判はある意味で日本の敗戦、そういうものについての総括を行ったと。だってそれに代わるものを日本持ってないんですから。
もう戦争ってやっぱり人を不幸にするだけで絶対やってはいけないっていうのが僕の考えでしたね。
The Japanese newspaper Asahi Shimbun wrote this about the tribunals shortly after the trial ended. The Tokyo trials are a lash on our past crimes. Its process definitely brings us shame, which is hard to look at squarely. But without facing the past, how can we go forward? Without concluding we were once a militaristic nation, there is no way for a new Japan to set out. If not crossing this critical pass, if not liquidating this reality, the light of the future will never guide us in the right way.